Hello, I'm Gabriella Kelly-Davies, and welcome to Biographers in Conversation, a podcast about the many choices biographers make while researching, writing, and publishing life stories. In this episode of Biographers in Conversation, I'm chatting with Marcia Biederman about the choices she made while writing The Disquieting Death of Emma Gill, Abortion, Death, and Concealment in Victorian New England. Marcia, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Who was Emma Gill, and why did you feel compelled to write her story?
Well, it's not just Emma Gill's story, but it is very much her story. It's about the discovery of the remains of a young woman who at that time was not known to be Emma Gill and was sort of an every woman. And in a pond in Connecticut, this was 1898. The body of a young woman had been dismembered and thrown in separate packages, the legs here, the torso there, the head there, over the course of 2 nights in Bridgeport, Connecticut. So what drew me to that story was the mystery of who was this young woman. At first, it was thought to have been a murder, where the murderer was trying to cover up the crime. But within hours, a medical examiner, even at that time, could determine that this was probably not a murder, but the accidental fatal consequence of an infection that set in after an abortion from an examination of the body parts. The medical examiner quickly determined this. And then, so Emma Gill, who was then the mystery young woman, the mystery victim, as some saw her, or the mystery patient, at least, was an enigma to the Bridgeport law enforcement community. And they asked for the public's help in identifying her. And at the time, fingerprinting identification was not available. So the only way they could have the public help them, because they said without identifying the victim, they couldn't identify the perpetrator of this crime. Abortion was then a serious crime, and particularly when, as a consequence, somebody died. So they wanted the public's help in identifying who this young woman was so that they could link it to whoever was responsible. So what they did was the head had already been dismembered from the body, separated from the rest of the body. They put the head on display at the city morgue in Bridgeport in a bucket with glass over it. And they invited the public to come see it. And thousands of people went by the face in the bucket and couldn't identify the young woman. And then the newspapers realized that tips were pouring into the Bridgeport police station. It seemed like everybody knew a neighbor, or they had a sister, a wife who had been gone for a few days and who they thought very possibly had gone for an abortion. So it illustrated to me how commonplace and acceptable, although illegal, abortion was at this time in 1898. And it opened up an incredible story to me. I also found out that suspicion immediately fell on a woman named Nancy Guilford, who was known to be an abortion provider in Bridgeport and had worked in other towns in Connecticut and, I discovered, Massachusetts. And this was a rich story that uncovered a truth about America that I had actually read about years before, but in a kind of academic book that didn't tell a story, but just had very useful statistics about how common criminal abortion was in late 19th century America. The story I found only took place in New England, Massachusetts, and Connecticut, but there were similar stories elsewhere. And I thought, this is a way of communicating to readers through a narrative what I had read as a history book by a scholar. And it's something that people needed to know because of the contemporary situation.
Yes, I am interested in the historical, social, and political context of the story and why it is so relevant to today.
Because the fact that abortion is widely available is not a good solution to women's needs to control their own bodies, to have bodily autonomy, to make their own decisions about where they're going in life, and when they or if they wish to become pregnant. And I find that right now we have a patchwork of state laws in the United States, even before Roe v. Wade, which guaranteed the constitutional right to abortion to all Americans, even before that was overturned. Abortion is available to some and not to others, depending on their income. People find some solutions sometimes. If their state has very restrictive laws banning abortion, some can go to another state and some can go to another country, as they did when I was in college, and abortion was illegal then in every state. But some people went to England, 4 states decriminalized it, and some people could travel there. But a lot of people can't do it. So I think that going back to 1898 and talking about, yes, it was commonplace, but it was criminal. What were the effects of making something available but criminal? It's sort of like alcohol or gambling, because we tried prohibition in the United States and it didn't work, so it was repealed. But during prohibition in places like New York City, people didn't take the law seriously. So everyone knew you could get a drink. If you went to a speakeasy, it might not be a very good quality drink, but you could get plastered on alcohol if you lived in New York all through prohibition. It was a big joke. Everyone was defying the law. And I find that this, during periods of criminalization of abortion in the United States, is very much the same. Some people will find a way to do it anyway. This is not a good solution. And I can illustrate this through the family. There was actually a married couple, Nancy Guilford and her husband, who was born Henry Guilford, but changed his name and used various aliases. And they actually became like a crime family. Although they were filling a need, and women were very, very happy to find them, because most of their abortions did not end up with a death and dismemberment of the body. They had thriving practices for 3 decades in 2 states, and obviously a lot of satisfied customers. But they degenerated into a crime family that, above all, tried to avert prison sentences. Both of them did serve time in jail. Nancy, the wife of the pair, she was sentenced to 16 and a half years and served most of that in 2 different jails. But they'd go right back to it. But it was not a good solution for society. And I'm just afraid now that many Americans are complacent. I think they think, if I have an unplanned pregnancy, if my daughter or granddaughter does, we'll find a way to get an abortion. It's like, I'm all right, Jack, as they used to say in the union movement, when people were complacent about their working conditions and didn't care about anyone else. And that's why I wrote the book, or what I discovered by researching, is how very dangerous this was for everybody involved. And not I just want to stress, it was dangerous not only because once in a while somebody died. I think that was an infrequent occurrence, but we'll never know because statistics weren't kept on how many crimes were committed. But it was dangerous in all kinds of ways. The decision making about when to do the operation did not have to do with the gestational age of the fetus. It had to do with when Henry and Nancy felt the law wasn't looking at them. And then the desecration of the bodies after death, all sorts of, the repercussions on the family itself, which was like the TV show The Sopranos or The Godfather. It was actually very painful for the grown children of this couple to have to live this way. So it was harmful all around.
I'm curious how you decided to portray Nancy and Henry as villains, heroines and heroes, or victims of society's hypocritical attitudes to abortion.
Well, that's a very interesting question. I would use the word antihero, which, as people are bandying around, I guess it's the name of a Taylor Swift song. But it is, I would say Nancy was an anti-hero. She was not a hero. She's a very flawed person she was not clamoring for abortion rights. As a matter of fact, she and Henry probably couldn't charge the prices they were charging had the procedure been legal. And also, they were, as far as I can tell, they had no formal medical training. So they at some point in the United States, licensing became required in most states, so they wouldn't have been allowed to even practice. But so she's definitely not a hero, but I think she is like someone you're fascinated with. As in a bank heist movie, you're almost hoping she'll evade the police at the end when they're bumbling around trying to find her as she becomes a fugitive and almost eludes them. She's a fascinating person, although very flawed. So she's an anti-hero. And I would say that Henry is a villain because
he was a con man, wasn't he?
He was a sexual predator also. I don't want to give too much away because I'd like people to read my book.
No.
He did harm to women who were under his care. Yes.
Something I'm always also curious about is that you opened the book with such a gruesome scene. Did you try lots of different openings or did you settle on that straight away?
I didn't try writing a lot of different openings. I think I considered them. I thought of different ways to begin the book. It seemed that if I was going to tell this as true crime and biography, that with true crime, it's standard to open with a body, and here especially this unidentified body. And I think the discovery of the body just made all those points I already talked about, that because she was this blank slate, people could project all the women in their lives onto her, and they were doing that. So in other words, it wasn't considered a marginal thing to seek an abortion. It was considered an everyday thing. So, so it just wasn't a natural, I think.
Yes. How did you research the book?
A lot of it was made available to me these days by newspapers.com and news archives, the databases that have these large collections of 19th and 20th century newspapers that are scanned and available from any laptop if you have a paid subscription, and also supplement. So it's very much from newspapers, supplemented by newspapers that haven't been scanned. So I went to various archives where they were available on microfilm, and the New York Public Library has special collections. So a lot of it was from newspapers, and some of it was prison records from Massachusetts. They thank you, Massachusetts State Archives. They have saved Nancy's prison records. Unfortunately, she entered as an inmate right before they started photographing everybody. So I was not able to get a photograph of her from the prison archives. And the state of Connecticut had the coroner's report on the body. Actually, there had been two, but the coroner misidentified the body and released it to the wrong family first. So that had been destroyed because that was a serious mistake that the coroner made. That's why Emma Gill was buried so many different times.
The story's engrossing. What devices, such as reconstructing scenes and creating suspense, did you employ to create such a compelling narrative? It is a true crime story as well as a biography.
Well, I'm glad you found it compelling, and I made a decision to take the information from trials and preliminary legal hearings, and instead of presenting them as testimony in every case, I use them as information and just set the scene. And then later, when Henry and or Nancy went to trial, I had to repeat, but then I would summarize. If I had already just said, for example, there's a woman named Jenny Peters who lived after an abortion, but she said that the abortion had been botched, and she testified that it had destroyed her health. And so did a friend of hers. A friend of hers corroborated that. So deciding that testimony was probably true, and this is me, the biographer, because I did have to make decisions about whether testimony was true, I just presented it to the reader that Jenny Peters went to this office, and this was really in her testimony, that there was a receptionist in the front office and she passed through the middle office to the rear. Now that actually had all just come out in court, but I wrote it as a narrative and later went back to her testimony in court and just, summed it up.
And to what extent did you manipulate pace and rhythm to create suspense?
Well, there are some natural cliffhangers that occur when we're researching. For example, this quote that was just perfect from a newspaper writing that the head of the unknown woman had been in a vat of embalming fluid so long that it had turned into probably rubber, and that even its own mother wouldn't recognize it. And then I decided to write what her brother would, because that's the next thing that happened, as the brother actually did go to Bridgeport from a distant town and identify it. Because the face indeed had degenerated a lot, but there was a mole on the woman's neck that hadn't been written about by the newspapers at all. And the brother asked to see that because he used to tease his sister Emma about the mole. And that's touching also, I think, that a young brother who used to tease his older sister about it ends up using that. The teasing becomes the key to identifying her. Very, very sad.
What are the book's major themes, and why did you choose those themes?
Well, it is about the criminalization of abortion. I think the crime family theme, that's because the daughter Eudora was always begging her parents to go legit. There were so many newspaper articles about that she had said, "I will work in a factory. Just please, mother especially, leave this business. Never do this again." And I just thought that is like so many crime movies I've seen. But of course, it was real. I believed it. It was such a pressure on her. And she became a great manipulator and liar too, but she had to. She was tampering with a witness. In the household, there were black servants. In Nancy Guilford's household, there were black servants who did housekeeping, and they were probably pressured into dismembering the body, or at least the mother was, a mother and a teenage daughter. And Eudora, the daughter, who most people saw as a sympathetic character, she did pressure the black servant who was younger, the teenager, into killing a cat so that they could use the animal blood to create some sort of red herring and throw the police off the trail, which didn't work at all. But imagine being pressured to do that because you need the income from a job. It was horrible. And later, she was also pressuring the mother in that pair to lie to the police. And both of those women were, well, one was a woman and one was a teenage girl, were held in prison for many months longer than any of the white people who were involved. and they were eventually released, but they were in jail a long time and were probably interrogated much more roughly by the police than the white figures in the book. I call them characters, but of course, as you know, we biographers call nonfiction figures characters.
And how did you decide to portray Adora? Is she an anti-hero? Is she a villain, an accomplice, collaborator?
Well, she had me snookered for a while. I thought she was, a poor innocent victim of circumstances. But then the killing of the cat, forcing another young woman to kill a cat, tampering with a witness. She also did some unpleasant things, although women today might applaud her. And leading a city alderman's son into believing she was engaged, that she loved him and wanted to marry him so that he bailed her and her brother out. I thought she was plucky and interesting. I will put it that way. She did bad things with the witness tampering, especially these vulnerable Black women were the victims of that. But I will say that people change, and a little later in life, she did go legit. And she did get Nancy Nancy was in her 60s, but was like getting back to it after 2 long prison sentences. But Eudora replaced her as the family breadwinner. Henry, the father, had already forsaken his family. He had married another woman without bothering to divorce Nancy, and said they were never legally married. But so he was out of the picture. They needed a breadwinner, and Eudora became a hairdresser. So in a way, she put her money where her mouth was. She did provide an alternative to crime. And Nancy, her mother, running out of steam because she was getting to be old, or just accepting this, did go and live with Eudora for the rest of her days until she died when she was in her 80s.
How did you decide to end the book, and why did you choose that ending?
Where Margaret Sanger is coming to Vassar. Yes. The very ending would be, I got to look at my own book because there's an afterword. Are you thinking of a particular scene, or I'm sorry, I had to look up my own book.
I was thinking about how you were reflecting on Nancy being in jail, and the extent to which you felt that she was given a raw deal.
Yeah, I have her, and before the afterword, it ends just with nobody recognized her on the train as she was being taken to jail. All the big city papers had left, and nobody even cared or recognized her on the train. This was the days before police had their own vehicles. They just would take the trains along with everybody else. It was sort of like Sherlock Holmes. It was a very interesting time in history. So they, without shackling her to the seat because they trusted her, they just took her on the train. Yeah, I left with that reflection. Nobody recognized her. And yes, society had, and the press had sort of used her as a sensation. It was something to liven up their humdrum lives, was to follow what was going on with her. So, yeah, although she's an anti-hero, she's somebody that had a lot of agency as a woman for those days. She certainly did harmful things. But, yeah, we're all responsible, I think, for what she was doing. The criminalization of abortion made a Nancy Guilford possible.
Yes. And what about the afterward? What was that all about? What were you trying to portray in that afterward?
I didn't want to keep the narrative going through the rather not eventful life after prison that Nancy had. So I just wanted to it was a wrap up, really, because I decided to stop the book really as a narrative, where she was going to prison. And I talked about the events that happened afterwards with Henry paying her a small amount of alimony as long as she stayed away from him. And Henry continuing his practice. I mean, I think he had women doing the actual procedures, and he was just a marketing guy. And he stayed out of jail and lived to a ripe old age. Bought a lot of real estate in Hartford, Connecticut, and did very well for himself. So that was to wrap things up, because that was where I saw the story ending, was with her sons. But I did include the information about Eudora becoming a hairdresser at Vassar, which is as close. Vassar was then an all-women's college that was created because at that time, the Ivy League colleges like Harvard and Yale did not admit women as undergraduates. So the Seven Sisters colleges, one of which I attended, Bryn Mawr, were formed and as a solution to that. And so Vassar was a very respected women's college, and the closest Eudora could get to getting into Vassar was to be a hairdresser on the campus. So that and then Margaret Sanger, who was a birth control advocate and activist, comes to speak on the very day, I think, that Nancy died.
That's incredible, isn't it?
Yes.
So it sort of had a good ending, didn't it? Because the daughter came good.
She did do what she said she always wanted. She had a legitimate business.
So are you working on another book at the moment?
Yes, I am. Well, the working title is The Princess in the Attic, and it's about a young dentist from Butler, Pennsylvania, right outside Pittsburgh, around the same time, 1897, went to the Klondike to search for gold, which thousands of Americans and Europeans did, Canadians did at the time. And he, like most of them, he didn't come back with any gold, but he did come back with an Alaska Native wife named Agnes. And she was 17 when she married him. He was 21. And he brought her back to his house in Pennsylvania. And his mother and sister were so appalled at the interracial marriage that they virtually kept her in an attic for the next 5 years. But and didn't introduce her to any of the neighbors. Nobody, just tried to keep her under wraps. The husband was never seen anywhere with her publicly, although he had 3 children by her. He often wasn't home, however. And she, against all odds, befriended the near neighbors, including a lawyer who agreed to take her divorce case, and very courageously sued her husband for divorce and won. And I have met. Then she fled with the children back to Alaska. One child tragically had died and is buried in an unmarked grave. It's still unmarked in Pennsylvania. But with the other 2, she brought them up in Alaska. Doesn't have a happy ending because natives were very badly treated in Alaska also. But I have talked to her descendants, and there's been a lot of intergenerational trauma, but they came out of it. They're wonderful, lovely people, and they're all for my doing this story. And it's very, very stirring and involving.
So you actually visited Alaska. So tell me about
that. Yes,
I
went once to meet Agnes's descendants. I was very lucky to find her grandson, who is 98 years old. He's passed away, though, since I visited. I was very, very fortunate to have met him. And I met his grown children and grandchildren and his wonderful wife. And then I went to present a paper on the Kenai Peninsula, which is a different... that Agnes's family lives in Ketchikan in southeast Alaska. And I went to the Kenai Peninsula, which is south of Anchorage, to present a paper. And it's just... Alaska is spectacularly beautiful And I met just great people through my research. You just experience the country differently when you're doing research there and interviewing sources. It's great.
So how long do we have to wait for that book?
I don't think you'd have to wait very long for me to write it, because I luckily was allowed to read Agnes's letters that she was writing through this critical period. She was writing loads of letters to all members of the family, which they have preserved. And everybody in the family wrote a lot. In those days, everybody wrote letters. But this family, both the white members and the native members, have preserved things. So it is just wonderful, and that the family's been so cooperative with me. But I think it's going to be hard to interest a publisher in it. That's the hard part.
Oh, that's a shame. I mean, it's always the hard part. But you've published so many books and you've got such a good reputation that I'm sure you'll find a publisher who just loves the book. So thank you so much for chatting with me today, Marcia. It's been fantastic. I really enjoyed our conversation.
Oh, I did too. And thank you so much for your encouragement, Gabriella. It means so much.
In this episode of Biographers in Conversation, Marcia Biederman revealed why she felt compelled to write The Disquieting Death of Emma Gill, Abortion, Death, and Concealment in Victorian New England. She outlined the historical, social, and political context and the book's relevance today more than a century after events occurred. Marcia explains why she opened the book with a gruesome finding and why she portrayed the abortionist Nancy Guilford as an antihero rather than as a villain, heroine, or victim. She also outlines the book's themes, especially hypocritical attitudes to abortion that continue today in some countries. Marcia shares her narrative strategy, conveying how she crafted propulsive narrative that makes The Disquieting Death of Emma Gill read like a true crime novel rather than a biography. Thank you for listening to Biographers in Conversation. Thank you to my producer Tara Northcott and to Sunny Lauderdale for the music. I'd like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, the traditional custodians of this land, and pay my respects to the elders both past and present. We'd love you to leave us a review and share the podcast if you enjoyed the show. If you'd like more information about my guests or their biographies, head over to biographersinconversation.com and read the show pages. I'm looking forward to our next conversation about the choices a biographer makes. I hope you are too.